April's does transdisciplinary and intersectional work. She examines the connections between contemporary targeted violences and exploitation, colonial conquest logics and legacies, community-defined justice, public health issues and the law. Within this space, Dr. Petillo focuses on areas of community resilience and interventions, as well as extra-Indigenous accountability. Informed by and prioritising Indigenous perspectives, the bulk of her research covers two areas. The first is native nation building theory, applied across Indigenous experiences and within social service, rather than purely economic contexts. The second is comparative investigation of targeted recruitment for trafficking.
Thank you very much, and it is true. I was born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia, lived there for the first 17 years of my life, and I have no idea who those people are on the Housewives of Atlanta.
And she's sticking to the story.
I am. There's proof. So I'm going to be operating two pieces of equipment here so that I can have my broad outline, but also show you some what I think are kind of pretty pictures. So if you'll bear with me, it will take me a second to get used to the rhythm of doing that. I want to begin by recognizing the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we live, work, play, and learn. I offer my continued acknowledgement, gratitude, and respect to these and my elders, past and present. I thank both the traditional owners and custodians of the land, as well as Charles Darwin University's Northern Institute in both Darwin and Alice Springs for their warm welcome. Everywhere I've gone associated with the Northern Institute has been really fun. So thank you for that. I appreciate it. And the land and the people that house the Northern Institute it's been amazing. So I also appreciate that. I hope that my words and deeds today honor them and continue to honor them. So hopefully you've seen this. This is the abstract of what I'll be talking about. It's basically Native nation building, and we're going to talk about this economic theory, and I am not an economist by any means, and how I have used it and how others have used it to think about issues of social justice and community building around, throughout, and across Indigenous community. So there's a context for the conversation that I'm going to have. I'm going to be referring to Indigenous and or Native nations and or communities. Know that I'm stretching the rubber band of how we use the phrase nation and community, because oftentimes when we think of the idea of a nation, we think of constitutions, we think of pieces of paper and legislation, but the reality is long before there was that written in English or written in a sort of Western language idea of what a nation was, there were communities that operated with a sense of peoplehood, the other concept, and thereby were operating much in the way of what we would call a nation today. The other thing that I feel is really important when thinking about Native nation building and Native nation rebuilding, if we're expanding that idea of what a nation is this idea of foundational transformative change. And I don't mean specifically just for an Indigenous community, I mean for how those of us who may not be identified as Indigenous operate with, create relationship with Indigenous communities. Because it is not just incumbent on Indigenous communities to change to meet what we're comfortable with, okay? A number of these ideas, if you find yourself interested and want to dig deeper, there are a number of books on it, but this is one of my favorites that sort of addresses a number of the conditions, and it comes from what's called Indian country itself in the U.S., and also from using examples of First Nations communities in Canada. So there's some starting assumptions. One of which that I think is the most important is that Oftentimes we talk about, in the U.S., the Indian problem, the indigenous problem, the native problem. And when we think about societies and cultures, and when we think about nations, and I dare say even economies, we need to realize that it's not that these are special communities that have special problems. These are problems that every community has, okay? And further, that indigenous nations, indigenous communities are no less capable of solving these problems than any other community. There's oftentimes struggle, shifting, trying things, learning lessons, figuring out where the successes are, and then sharing those stories of success. One thing that is unique about these communities is that oftentimes there are constraints that have been created outside of what happens within that particular community. And those particular constraints often color the perception of who they are, what they do, how they operate, and why they may make the choices that they make. The other thing, which I find really important, is that it's not just about economic development. When we talk about solutions, you need to think about this as building societies that work and that work well for all of the people that are in it, as well as those engaged with it. So oftentimes I talk about Native America, okay? And in this context, I might talk about it as Indigenous Australia. And people will frequently say, well, what do you mean? Like, this is not, you know, there's not one native country, or there's not one Indigenous Australia. Well, I'll tell you what I mean. What I mean by that is thinking about, with that question, the trajectory where nations that understood themselves, and I'm using here the U.S. context, as essentially communities that governed themselves and governed their relationships with other communities or nations around them, how they went from that to being thought of as cultural groups. And then further, being thought of as these legally defined spaces created by treaties, created by wars with Western nations. And how, after being thought of as this legalized space, then become much smaller territories, become reservations or reserves. The thing is, life and people have a funny way of coming back. They'll cycle back, they'll adapt, all as a means of survival. And part of that survival is about this complex idea of peoplehood that I'm going to sum up in about a minute or two, out of respect for the time we have here. So when you think of it, peoplehood is this idea that people using these four elements of language, land, ceremony, and history, all of which influence each other, come to a shared understanding, a shared sense of belonging, a shared idea of what knowledge is and how to transfer that knowledge to other people and other generations. And in particular, when you're thinking about most indigenous communities, a shared sense of how they operate within and function within a place, how they are connected to a particular geographic region and environment. So when you think about the impact of peoplehood, let me go back a section, there's an identity that's connected with this. And yes, you can kind of futz with one or the other, and that will impact the other three areas. But as I said, peoplehood is a resilient kind of state of being. And what that means is that, I told you it would take me a second to skip things forward. Okay. Is that people come back. So a couple of slides ago, we had this idea of nations, indigenous nations that understood themselves as nations, being reduced all the way down to reservations. And in the modern times, quote unquote, you have people reclaiming language, reclaiming traditional names, and reclaiming the understanding of their connection to place and their connection within community. And as a result of that, despite land loss and theft and sometimes loss of sacred language or ceremony or knowledge to some degree, these entities, these indigenous communities persevere and move on. In the U.S., it's nowhere near the numbers that it used to be, but there's 566 tribes, 66 tribes that are federally recognized, and that AK stands for Native Alaskan Villages. Just didn't want to overwhelm with words here. And approximately 236 state-recognized tribes and tribal groups. Those are just the ones that are recognized by federal entities. There are hundreds more that live and function with a sense of peoplehood and who and how they operate. And as a result of that, those recognized communities, and to a certain extent some of those unrecognized communities, find ways to participate in self-government that touch on all of these areas. The only ones that aren't sort of, for some communities, regulated by a federal service are those three. So when we're talking about indigenous nations and native nations and communities, part of what's important is to understand that we're talking about communities with great responsibilities to the citizens that are a part of those nations, those communities. So what is Native Nation building? The idea behind this theory relies on 4 decades of research on economic development and governance among American Indian nations and other, though not all, indigenous peoples around the globe. So this theory, I was told a story that a couple of guys said, okay, there are some Native communities in the U.S. that are faring really well. They're providing services to their community, from health care to housing. They are in charge of regulating resource management. They give out fishing licenses and hunting licenses, and through those processes, as well as business ventures like casinos and restaurants and resort areas on their land, they are meeting the needs of their people. And there are other indigenous communities in the U.S. that, even though they have a wealth of resources, just cannot seem to meet all the needs of their people. And these guys said, let's go figure out what's going on. The story I was told was that they got together in a car, of the kind of car that my mentor, who is Danae, calls your classic res car. So imagine the car, that you're not 100% sure will make it, but somehow does. And they traveled all around the country talking to indigenous leaders in their communities, talking to indigenous citizens in their nations to find out, okay, what is it that's going on? They all got back together over a couple of beers. He didn't admit it, but probably a few pizzas. They said, these are the things that we see. This is what seems to make sense. And that's where this theory came from, okay? Further, they said, well, we can't just keep this to ourselves. That's not helpful. It's about sharing information and sharing knowledge, sharing the success stories, because sharing those stories are important, even and especially when you're sharing it with communities who haven't quite worked out how to get to their own success. We'll find out why in a reason, but I'll just leave it with, it helps to enlarge the imagination, and it encourages people to imagine doing something and moving to a different place than what they know in this particular present moment. A lot of it has to do with this idea of seizing the future, which is basically a simple model about why we act or don't act, both as individuals and communities. And it comes out of sort of organizational thinking, it comes out of sociology as well, thinking about movements. And it has to do with in many ways, these three areas: the external situation, the internal situation, and interpretations. So the external, that political, legal, economic piece, that's the stuff that you can kind of influence a little bit, but it takes time. It could take decades, it could even take centuries, okay? And it involves a lot of cooperative work among numerous groups of people. The internal situation, those are the things that are sort of right there on the ground. The people that are present in a community, the skills that they have, both from traditional understanding as well as Western understanding, if and where it's applicable. The propensity towards a particular kind of orientation or organization. Is this an indigenous community where everyone above a certain age is thought to have leadership potential and should be able to speak on matters of importance to the community? Or is it a community where one or two people are thought to be the leaders because they exhibit particular qualities or not? All of these exist within those internal situations. One of the most important pieces is the area of interpretations, right? And that's the stories that we tell ourselves about what that external and that internal situation mean together, and how we can function within the space between those particular situations. Part of why that's important is because it colors how we operate within these 6 steps, okay? So whenever there's a situation that's an opportunity, right? We look at that external and that internal situation and we say, we need to make a decision about whether we take that opportunity or we don't. We create this sort of pros and cons list, or we do calculated risks, or my husband and I frequently will talk about the input that we get from head, heart, and gut. There's any number of ways to do it, but it all comes down to these 6 steps. The recognition that something is wrong, that things can be different, whose responsibility it is to make those things happen. And by responsibility, I don't mean in that finger-wagging way. I mean who has the power, who has the ability to change things, and who should be changing those things. And then using that to determine what needs to be done as a result. And the last step, the one that everybody else sees, is if you decide to act or not. With each of these steps, and based on those decisions, it's an opportunity for communities and individuals within those communities to become less dependent on others and to take on more decision-making responsibilities. Sounds pretty simple, right? Yes? No? No? If you said no, you're dead on. It's not as simple as it sounds. It can be quite involved. And part of why that becomes so involved has to do with how the interpretations play out around these 4 ideas. So you're interpreting the situation. And honestly, there are just some concrete situations that you can't do much to change. And it's about figuring out how to maneuver around that, what is worthwhile and what is possible. When you get into that realm of thinking about what is possible, you're getting into the realm of interpretation. And indigenous communities around the world face a number of things, including very real legal constraints. Not so long ago, not just in Australia and not just in the US, indigenous communities could not be considered to be landowners, right? So if you think about, in the US, there are all these conversations about old wealth and new wealth, and basically that's the distinction between who had land a long time ago, because you could use the land to create what the US considered wealth, versus who just recently got access to this new concept of money, or who just recently got access to land to then use the resources right, wrong, or indifferent. Those are some of the things that influence the perception of what's possible in Indian country and in indigenous communities, and figuring out how to manage resources and manage or maneuver around what is possible within those very real constraints. There's also the concern around culture. And here I specifically mean a shared set of understandings that shape how a people or a community deals with each other and the world around them. It also influences initially how people think about situations. So there are some cultures that encourage sort of what in Western thinking would be considered a confident stance in any situation. This sort of idea of I can address whatever comes up, I can wrestle it until it bends to my will, I can do all of these things. And there are other cultures that are a lot more, for lack of a better way to put it, peaceful, that are a lot more into collaborative, cooperative work that looks to respect all beings on multiple levels. It's not about wrestling something under control. That particular piece of culture can be read one way or another and then impact those situations, both internal and external. There's also knowledge. Now, there's the knowledge that comes from culture, there's the knowledge that comes from community, and then there's the knowledge that has to do with how systems work, how governments work, how economics would work, how development works, generally speaking. Knowledge is encased, that knowledge encases all of those options. And there are particular lessons that as communities, indigenous and non-indigenous, sort of developed and progress over time, that we need to figure out if we're going to have success, if we're going to have a society that works. And there's also, it's on the bottom, but I don't think it's the least important, it's this idea of leadership. And that's kind of the secret weapon when you think about action or inaction. Because you have these three things up above that frequently give you a story about how you approach opportunities and how you address opportunities, and even if an opportunity is worthwhile. But if you have a leader, and a leader can be an individual or a group of people, it can be someone elected, it could be someone born into a position, it could be 4 or 5 teenagers who get together, have a great idea, and say, we want to share this with our community. It can be anybody, any size group. But if they have the ability to think differently about the story and find a way to not only communicate that, but get other people excited about this new story, they can then mobilize an entire community. They can change the story, they can change the interpretation, which thereby changes potentially propensity to action and even the way that action might unfold, or the choice of action that seems most reasonable in that particular situation. So if you are working as an indigenous community or working with an indigenous community that sees the situation but feels almost fatalistic about it, one of the things to recognize is that it's not innate to a particular community. It's not even an indigenous community issue. It's because there's been a story that's been on repeat, that's been on a loop, right? That these are the people who have the power to change things. This is the way that it goes for us. These are the things we'd have to give up to have the situation be different. And we are not willing to give those things up to make that situation different. Because those things are vital to our sense of who we are. if one could change that story easily, the chances are that it's already happened, right? Because once that story gets on that loop, every opportunity that comes starts to look the same, and we have the same response to that no matter who we are, no matter where we come from. But once you have that leader, and once you have the idea that that external situation in particular can change, then you can do things like build on culture. You can harness this idea of collaborative, collective work. You can harness this idea of peoplehood, the histories and values, and put it in the service of rebuilding a nation or building a nation. Part of that then informs the way that knowledge is acquired, right? It says you are looking for some different things when you prioritize what knowledge is important. Please understand that doesn't always mean that traditional knowledge is no longer important. Frequently what that means is that traditional knowledge, that sacred history, is even more important. And it's an opportunity to exercise leadership broadly and think differently about how the community might adapt or not to the opportunities that make themselves present. And changes happen. So in the US, this is an example of a pretty huge external situation that changed. Prior to 1975, indigenous communities that were recognized by the federal government were dependent on the federal government for creating and providing safety and protection, even on reservation lands. It all came from the federal government. So part of what this meant, and with few exceptions, which has to do with something called PL 280, which is a whole nother 2-hour conversation at the very least. So I'm just going to drop that pin there, and if you want, I'll talk about that later. But in those, beyond those instances that involve Public Law 280, imagine you live in an area that is pretty remote, but the only way that you can have certain crimes investigated and thereby adjudicated, you have to rely on an investigator to come from a capital city that's 4 or 5 hours away. For some of us in this room, that's not that hard to imagine. So what happens to the evidence of crime? What happens to the people who have survived that particular moment of violence if their safety and protection is so far away? This particular law basically encouraged tribal decision-making. Part of it is because it allowed a process by which indigenous communities could then work directly with the federal government, and the money that used to be sent to provide safety and protection from 4 hours away could be then diverted into the tribal community, which would then provide their own police force. Okay? The same is true for health services. The same is true for areas of education. So it created this opportunity for tribes to then direct and make decisions directly about their education, safety and protection, as well as health services. This isn't just something that happened in the US. There's also something similarly big that happened here in Australia as well, right around the same time. The Aboriginal Land Rights Act of 1976, which we talked about land in many ways being the source of wealth in Western communities. It sort of created this opportunity for indigenous communities, Aboriginal communities in Australia to, one, have it recognized in an official way that land was taken. And therefore some opportunities, including traditional access to land and kinship with land was impacted by those choices and those actions. Oops. I hit the wrong button. Okay. These two, in effect, and even though the federal governments didn't say, in those moments, we were wrong, it was really bad what we did, take all the land back immediately, we reverse everything that we did, these are also incredible opportunities for Indigenous communities because they kind of creak open the door to say, you have some decision-making power here, and we're going to recognize that decision-making power. This is an opportunity. It's an opportunity then to say, what are we going to do with that? And are we just going to do that, we're going to follow the law to the letter, or are we going to come up with our own self-determined ways of thinking about things? And if it doesn't work for you, we'll figure it out later. But right now, we're taking this idea of sovereignty, we're taking this idea of who we are and how we operate and how we self-govern, and we are rolling with it. Enter this idea of development. The standard way of thinking about development is over here on what would be your left. Okay? And I think this probably applies the world over. Someone else sets the agenda. You're thinking about development frequently as just an economic problem. Indigenous culture, and frankly any culture, is frequently viewed as an obstacle because the culture of forward development becomes prioritized in the standard approach. Decision-making can frequently be short-term and non-strategic because it's about sort of that moving forward. And this leaves elected leadership and people in policy-making positions in that place of really having to figure out how to distribute resources. Okay? So that's frequently the position that the leaders are put in. But then if you think about things from a nation-building approach, it's a little bit different. Okay, a lot different, frankly. And I've highlighted two areas where I think it's really, really important to note the difference. One is that Native nations and Indigenous communities and nations are then, within this approach, asked to assert decision-making power. That, in this case, is a nice way for me to say sovereignty. To assert sovereignty and to assert self-determined ideas of governance and policymaking. And to do it in a practical way. To do it in a way that says, this is what we need, and this is what responds to our political culture. What's a cultural match to how we understand things should work, and these are the solutions that we are moving forward with. And then to find practical ways of moving forward with that. Part of what happens when this is the case is that you end up with Native nations putting into place effective governing institutions because it speaks to that community's understanding of what a leader is and what a leader does and what leadership looks like. You also find that decision-making is strategic because there's an investment in the idea of what is being continued, okay? That investment goes not just in that sort of, if you have, in the US, I don't know if it's a popular phrase here, but the thinking if you have skin in the game, you're more likely to put more effort into it. It goes even beyond that because we're talking about communities that are looking for future generations, not just their children, not just their grandchildren, to be able to speak the language, to be able to understand tradition, to be able to function within and with, in their everyday life, the sacred history that has been passed down. And then you have a sense of leadership that is shared in a different way, where you can really recognize that leadership that doesn't just come from one person, but comes from multiple people. And based on those long car rides 40 years ago, you find that there are different results. In indigenous communities, oftentimes when the standard approach is used, you have failed enterprises, you have this kind of politics of spoils where one group or one community is well off during one particular period, let there be a shift, and then they have nothing and the other group tends to get everything. And there's a high dependence on outside money, on outside ideas, on outside leadership, and outside concepts to survive. When you have Native nation building approaches used or indigenous nation building approaches used, you find that everything just tends to be a little bit more effective. And there's increased chances of sustaining that improvement. Part of that is because you find that there's a sense of a different story. There's a sense that being active and present in an indigenous community is not just about, and that just is kind of in quotes there, preserving a community and keeping cultural ideas alive, but it's also about preserving forward movement for that community in a different way that doesn't require the same level of dependence. So essentially, I spent all of that time to explain in detail this, that indigenous nation building is about this idea of indigenous people groups realizing their own cultural, educational, economic, environmental, and political objectives through foundational actions that are of their own design and initiation. Folks that work with the Northern Institute, based on conversations I had with folks in Darwin, it sounds very similar to me to this idea of working ground up within non-indigenous agencies and groups. Realizing that, yeah, this is the way you've always done it, but it's not going to fly when you're working with an indigenous community that has always done it their way. That from the very foundations, there might be a need to rethink that process. And when that happens, you can find that there are societies that are capable of doing and providing and pursuing all of these things that, again, change that story. It changes stories of, we can never do this. There's always someone against us. There's always the government not working with us, or the assumption that we're primitive and backwards. Changing that to, no, we're very capable of making this happen. And further, and perhaps to some, most importantly, that we're capable of doing this with people outside of our community who actually see and hear and recognize us at this time. And this is called the flub up on the PowerPoint. There we are. So successful Native nation or indigenous nation rebuilding has to do, again, with creating that strong sense of leadership so that you have indigenous groups that are successful on their own terms, not according to what we think they should do in terms of health, not doing what we think they should do in terms of prioritizing business, prioritizing cultural concerns, but what's important to them and what they have asserted as their right, and recognizing and respecting that. So, when thinking about the theory in and of itself, there are these sort of 5 principles that I've hinted at when talking about moving from inaction to action and thinking about what is a successful example of this. All of these things are in place, and they all influence one another and create situations where you can have an indigenous community that feels like it is moving in the direction that it wants to move, in the way that it wants to move, with people in the community that feel like their needs are being met on multiple levels. One of the things that's key, I started off by saying this is a theory that comes out of economics and economic sociology, okay? And I'm not an economist. I come from a history of social justice advocacy and grassroots community work around wellness, issues of health, and issues of access to safety and justice. And I focus on law and policy. And I have found that the idea of Native nation building and coming from that approach has helped on pretty much every project that I can think of that I've worked on with Indigenous and or Native communities. And part of it is because all of these things are tied into it. We're talking about this idea of shared values and norms, talking about shared goals and burdens, as well as well-being and how to get to that when you have formal and informal institutions that sometimes feel like they're working with us and sometimes feel like they're working completely against us for our eradication. Okay? So that brings us to a place of thinking about, so how do you think about this and use this when thinking about social justice and thinking about public policy? And part of it is recognizing that you're thinking about processes that honor these particular elements that are important to communities, Indigenous or not. Realizing those, acknowledging that you realize those, and respecting those dreams that they have for themselves. A lot of times in Native America, when people talk about this, there's also the conversation about recognizing that it is giving a new memory, i.e. giving a new story to children, to grandchildren, to 7 generations out, 7 to 10 generations out from the present time. This theory has been applied in more arenas than many people can imagine. It's been applied, these are all projects that have occurred out of Northern Arizona University and University of Arizona and the Native Nation building programs that they have there. These have been projects that have been basically commissioned by Native communities to have people at those universities who are well versed in the theory, including some graduate students, work on for them. Okay? So there have been things like addressing through Truth and Reconciliation Commissions the injustices of the school systems for First Nations people in Canada, developing a way to integrate language as part of language revitalization into sort of everyday after-school activities, thinking about how to create a way to educate tribal citizens, some of whom have varying levels of literacy around constitutional changes that are going on within the Crow Nation, as well as building education for the Shinnecock is one of the newly federally recognized communities in the U.S. They basically, part of their traditional homeland is, I believe, part of Martha's Vineyard. I don't know if you guys know, it's a very hoity-toity, expensive area. Presidents have vacationed there. So for that to be recognized as Indigenous land, that means some people lost some money, and it's a very big deal. Native nation building and Indigenous nation building has also been used to think about health and social service in terms of honoring treaty agreements within Canada, as well as thinking about how to advocate for border crossing rights around U.S., Canada, and Mexico for Indigenous peoples, right? Thinking about things like passports, what passports are legitimate. I'll give you an example of why this is an issue. Outside of Tucson, Arizona, which is in the very southern part of the state, there's a community, the Tohono O'odham, whose traditional homelands that they still live on and claim actually encompasses the U.S.-Mexico border. And with some of the challenges, to put it nicely, going on in the U.S. around that southern border, there were people, there were elders who did not have birth certificates because they were not born in Western hospitals, who were not allowed to go and participate in ceremony that only they were allowed to participate in because they could not legally cross the border, right? So thinking about ways to ensure that these elders had access to medicinal plants and family members and ceremonial sites and rites that were important to this particular community, that's a nation building issue, right? And of course, there's economic development that this theory has been applied to. So I'll give you an example out of work that I've done. Somehow I ended up throwing myself into working with a business development corporation out of Canada. And I walked into that thinking, I'm the last person you want. I'm like the activist, like, are you sure you want me in here? But part of what we did, this was a community, it was a tribal council that was built from 11 different bands that had often traded together in times past and lived in similar territory, and they were part of the Treaty 4 area. So they had already had a corporate strategic plan done, but it was not really helping them in the work that they were trying to do. They were not seeing success. So myself and a partner went in and we looked at what are the nation building principles that are applicable here. And we said, because the treaty for the Canadian government, bless you, the treaty is that sort of governmental document, but for these communities, it's a covenant because their ancestors made concessions and traded things to ensure that their way of life, their understanding of the world would continue unharmed. So it had sacred importance for them, part of which goes into their business dealings. Because remember, 11 bands who traded together were now represented by this area and this tribal council. And those were the folks that this development corporation spoke to. So part of what we ended up doing was blending the nation-building principles with Treaty 4 principles that were considered sacred principles coming from this community, and figured out ways to put that model to work for them. So it meant doing things like including these principles in the policy manual, including these principles in the information that's shared with businesses that want to work with that development corporation. And it went down to figuring out ways to walk the talk. Like, what does it look like to have business dealings with this particular indigenous community? Well, part of what that looks like is you don't go in and shake hands. You set up a time to meet so that you can all sit down and you can smoke the pipe together. Because that is how negotiations around the treaty started. And that became an important part of indigenous businesses who had non-indigenous investors figuring out that they could actually trust those investors not to be swindling them. And it is not something you will learn in any business course anywhere, that you need to do this with this community. Another project had to do, which is much more along the lines of the work that I do in my scholarship, is community healing in Northern Cheyenne, which had, at the time, great concerns, like many other indigenous communities, about the instances of sexual and intimate partner violence going on within the community. And the Northern Cheyenne have a really wonderful process for developing tribal code that's pretty seamless. How much time do we have?
10 minutes. You
10 minutes,
don't-
okay. Really wonderful, almost seamless process for it. Almost anyone can sign up to be recognized by the tribal council at a meeting, and you go and you present what you would like to be code. The council goes back and discusses it, and then they make recommendations. You can have an effective code written and moved forward and thought of as the law of that tribal land within about a month's time. This may have changed since then, but at the time that I did this project, that was essentially the process. There are many, many governing bodies that should be jealous of such a seamless process. And there were, within this particular community, due to Indian boarding schools in that area, with the Catholic Church that was within that area, just on the outskirts of the town, that, people had to go by that church site, and it sort of reintroduced trauma for a number of people anytime they had to go by to get groceries, because they'd heard the stories from parents, or they'd experienced terror and horror within those walls within that area. So part of what I did with another partner was think about these Native Nation building blocks, as we call them, these principles, and figured out how they could be applied in this particular situation to think about how to basically create tribal code that better responded to the situation that people in the community found themselves in. So over here you have a brief sample of what was at the time the current ordinance, and then considerations that were all informed by this idea of what works within a culturally based understanding of the needs and what is helpful for healing within this particular community. And we also use this idea of transformative justice, which was very similar to some Northern Cheyenne ideas about justice, but again, modified for a cultural match to this particular community. And then we came up with what we called buckets and bundles. So buckets, basic areas of movement that the community could easily access to create important action that was applicable in the here and now, and then bundled them into next steps that might be more easily created. And we sort of created this matrix of no touch, low touch, moderate touch, and high touch, so that people could understand right up front what was possible, but also know that they were doing things that matched culturally what made sense for them. Another issue, and because there's some things still going on with this project, and it is their information, so I need to be sensitive to that. Another community in another part of Native America where, again, sexual violence was used as a tool of power, and very prevalent and really concerning a particular group of people within the community. So in this case, the leaders thinking about this is a great example, would not be the elected officials or one person, but it was community members who were thinking about agricultural health and how to revive traditional foods. A council of elders who didn't really do anything with governments in this particular community. They were more about making sure traditions were still in place, and a community program for youth that was led by youth. They all said, this is not a good situation for us. We need to do something different. We need to figure out how to get the tribal council and the tribal council president and past researchers to listen to what we have to say. This is a community that had been part of previous research. The researchers gave their findings to the tribal council that then said, we don't want you to ever publish this. So even the people in the community were not aware of what researchers had found about the prevalence of sexual violence in their communities. Let me go back. So part of what at this point has happened is through some of these efforts and having conversations with the researchers, we've been able to convince the current tribal council president to receive the report from the researcher, convince the researcher to release it to the tribal council with the agreement that that will be shared with this community of people so that they can build a response and a community process that addresses their needs. So I don't want to leave you with the this will never be addressed feeling. This is something that's in progress, and there's good, positive progress that is coming out of this. But it's not just my crazy idea that this can be applied beyond economics. One of the groups that's sort of a partner in coming up with this, the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development, they have a website where they both talk about Native nation building, but they honor indigenous nations all over the world who engage in these principles and share their success stories. And they've done some really nifty things with technology recently. You'll have access to this PowerPoint, and it will go up on the PPP seminar site. So this will be an active link for you if you're ever feeling like you don't want to type it in. This is out of a partnership with Google, where they have a map, and every nation that has had a success story and been honored by this group, you can click on this site and you can hear their story or read their story or see pictures from their story. This is their Twitter feed, which I think is new this year or maybe last year, the end of last year, where they have Throwback Thursdays and Free Resource Fridays, and they tell you stories about what has happened in community and how these nations are practically asserting sovereignty in a way that is culturally appropriate, and they are seeing positive results. One option to think about that deals with law and public policy has to do with the Potawatomi Leadership Program, where they are basically cultivating future leaders by engaging youth with elders in the process of governance. There's also one of my personal favorite success stories that I often use has to do with, I want to say Tulalip community in Washington. I can't believe that it may not be the Tulalip, but I think it is the Tulalip, where they had a great problem with drugs being in the community, and a number of young folks were going to prison because of interaction with drugs and drug trafficking. And basically, one mother said she went to a judge during her son's hearing and said, "He's not a bad kid. He's lost his way in the community. He's lost his way in our principles. If there were a way to make part of his sentence that he needs to sort of re-engage with this, I really think that would help." That seed started an entire process whereby when indigenous youth are coming up on particular charges, they go before the tribal court. The tribal court then engages case managers. It engages rehabilitation treatment folks. It engages community elders. It engages people who, if there was a crime committed, people who may be victims of that crime. And it's an elaborate legal and very specifically tribal for this community response to bringing people back into the community and back into their responsibility to the community. All very focused on their specific way of Yes, it was the Tulalip Alternative Court. Their specific way of looking at and doing this work. I think I will end there. I've probably exceeded those 10 minutes. Thank you so much for your time and attention. And are there any questions, comments?
Where to start?
It's a lot.
It is a lot. It's fascinating and very exciting and fantastic. It's great to know that there's, you know, literature and websites and all of those links. And personally, I'm sure probably a lot of us will follow up from the seminar. Yeah, I have a couple of questions. I didn't write them down as I was going on something else. I wouldn't think.
I felt like you were talking about one right here at the start. Very similar.
Yeah.
I just want to thank you too. Probably the best and most appropriate presentation I've heard in a very long time.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, so thanks very much.
Yeah, it's, I will tell you, like I said, I started out as a social activist, right? And doing this work in the academy, well, first the academy felt alien to me when I first came to it. But doing this work really feels like it does speak to the needs on the ground, you know, and it's one of the important keys for me is understanding how important cultural match is and how important that sort of recognition that other people may say there's no sovereignty, that you can't decide this, that you can't understand that. But if you're paying attention to cultural match, sometimes there's, in your gut, you know that that's not the case, right? And that nugget alone just speaks to so many, I think, of the issues that we see around governance, around some of the programs that are well-meaning and want to do right, but if you're always coming from a place of thinking this community has to meet what I feel comfortable with, you're never going to get anywhere. And this is one of the first theories that I'd seen where I was like, yeah, that's right. Okay, I can do this, you know. So I do feel like it's applicable in so many places. And it doesn't have to be the only thing that works, but it speaks to a lot. So thank you. Thank you for that.
Sorry, if I may. We want to agree with what Sean's saying, totally. I think what you're saying to me anyway is, amongst other things, you talked about the Land Rights Act and how important it was, and the fact that it's still going 40 plus years. That it was given time to actually bed down and work itself through. And all too often, a lot of what happens with Aboriginal policies and programs is about 2 or 3 years lifespan, and then somebody thinks it's a bit broken, so we better change it. And that opportunity to really bed down and work it through, as you say, to sort out the problems internally is just such a powerful message.
It is. I mean, I'll tell you, right before arriving in Australia, I was spending time in New Zealand, and there's the, I fear I'm going to say it wrong, so please correct me if I do, the Treaty of Waitangi. You know, and part of what I do oftentimes is, you know, I'll get in a cab or I'll be on a bus or be at a coffee place or somewhere, and I'll just start a conversation with folks. And inevitably they ask me, well, what do you do? And I tell them. And the moment I say I focus on Indigenous rights and I think about, you know, law and policy around that, one of two things happen. Their eyes glaze over, and you can kind of see that happen, and then they go, oh, that's really important work, that kind of thing. Or I I get to hear all of their thoughts, right, wrong, or indifferent, about what's going on in Indigenous communities. In New Zealand, I had this one guy sort of say, yeah, we have this treaty, but it took so long for it to happen, and why does it have to be that way? Why couldn't we just do that in a year? And, you know, and I thought to myself, treaties are never like, that doesn't happen in a week or a month, right? And there was an entire process of having to get Indigenous communities across a pretty large chunk of land to even listen and then see how it benefited them as individual communities. And I do think that's an issue. A lot of times, if you come from a Western perspective, it's easy to paint this brush of there's, and I do use the phrase Native America, but I do it recognizing that it's thousands of communities, right? Any area that has an Indigenous population has multiple communities that either are in that place or work with that community, or all of these influences. And when we start to recognize that, my hope is that we can have a little bit more humble patience around the process of negotiating these relationships. Because any good relationship takes time.
Okay, any more questions?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'll ask you to join me